Imagine a man so skilled at escaping prison that guards once found him on the roof, hours after he was locked inside a high-security cell. He didn't use violence. He didn't have tools. He just understood how things worked. Locks, doors, and routines. His name was Mark DeFriest, and in Florida's prison system, he became known as the Houdini of Florida. Welcome to the murder maze. Today, we're not talking about a killer. We're talking about a man whose story raises hard questions about the justice system, mental health, and what happens when someone is punished for being different. This is the case of Mark DeFriest. Mark DeFriest was born in 1960 in Tallahassee, Florida. From the outside, his early life didn't look much different from any other boy growing up in the South. But inside the home, things were more complicated. Mark's father, a former military man, was strict, private, and deeply structured. He worked as a mechanic and had a love for precision. Mark looked up to him, not just as a father, but almost as a hero. He followed him everywhere, studied his every move, and learned by watching. By the time Mark was 6 years old, he could take apart and reassemble machines most adults couldn't even operate. Radios, engines, clocks, nothing was too complex for him. School was another story. Mark struggled to fit in. Teachers noticed he was intelligent, but he didn't follow instructions well. He was restless, didn't understand social cues, and seemed to live in his own world. Other kids often bullied him. He wasn't aggressive, but he could be unpredictable. One moment he was quiet and focused on drawing or building something, and the next he might react to a noise or touch in a way that seemed extreme. No one, not even his teachers, knew what to make of him. Psychologists today would likely recognize signs of autism or a related neurodevelopmental condition. But in the 1960s and 70s, that understanding just didn't exist in schools like Mark's. Instead of support, he was seen as a problem child, bright, but difficult. Mark's home life wasn't much easier. His mother left the family when he was still young. His father remarried, but Mark never grew close to his stepmother. He became more withdrawn, more isolated. He found comfort in machines. He would spend hours in the garage, building elaborate mechanical devices or taking apart locks just to see how they worked. By the time he was a teenager, Mark had developed skills that were far beyond his years. He could fix almost anything. He built his own zip lines, made trapdoors, and even modified tools without ever being formally taught. But while his hands were gifted, his emotions were fragile. He had no close friends. He didn't trust people easily. And when he felt misunderstood, he often acted out, sometimes by running away, sometimes by hiding in bizarre places like the attic or roof for hours. Despite these challenges, Mark never got into serious legal trouble as a child. He wasn't a criminal. He was simply a boy who didn't fit. A boy whose gifts were ignored and whose differences were misunderstood. His father, perhaps the only person who truly understood him, became the center of his world. When his father died in 1979, everything began to fall apart. That moment, the death of the one person who made Mark feel safe, would set off the chain of events that changed his life forever. As Mark DeFriest entered adulthood in the late 1970s, he was not like most 18-year-olds. He didn't drink, party, or socialize much. He spent most of his time working with machines or building complex mechanical systems at home. He had no formal training, but he could do work that even trained technicians struggled with. He was especially skilled with locks, motors, and tools. At the same time, his behavior raised concern. Mark had trouble understanding rules in the adult world. He followed his own logic, which often clashed with what society expected. For example, he would work obsessively on a project for days with no sleep, and then disappear into the woods alone when overwhelmed. He didn't understand laws in a conventional way. To him, things were either logical or not. Right or wrong didn't always register in the way it did for others. He also had trouble managing stress. Loud noises, sudden changes, or confrontations could set him off. When that happened, he sometimes lashed out or acted impulsively, behaviors that frightened people who didn't understand him. But he wasn't violent by nature. He was isolated, misunderstood, and emotionally raw. Mark's relationship with his stepmother remained distant. After his father passed away, Mark became focused on one thing: retrieving the tools his father had promised him. These tools were important to him, not just as physical items, but as symbols of his bond with his father. He believed they belonged to him. So, when he took them before the will was processed, he didn't think it was a crime. In his mind, he was simply claiming what was his. This decision, made as a young adult still trying to find his way, would become the turning point in his life. But at that time, Mark didn't see it that way. He was just a young man trying to hold on to the only part of his past that made sense. His adult years had barely begun, and already, Mark DeFriest was on a path filled with misunderstanding, legal trouble, and mental health struggles. He hadn't yet committed a serious crime. He hadn't hurt anyone, but the system was already starting to close in. But his most infamous escape attempt involved stripping naked, coating himself in soap, and squeezing through the bars of his cell. It sounded like a joke, but it was real, and it worked. As the escapes piled up, the system came down harder on him. Each attempt meant more time added to his sentence. The original charge, the tool theft, should have only cost him a year or two. But the escapes, the erratic behavior, and his refusal to follow rules led to something much bigger, a reputation. Guards and officials began to treat him not as a troubled man, but as a manipulative and dangerous criminal. They labeled him a threat. But much of his behavior was tied to fear and confusion, not violence or evil intent. Inside prison, things got even worse. Mark was often placed in solitary confinement. His mental state began to unravel. At times, he would act out in disturbing ways, smearing feces, shouting for hours, or self-harming. These incidents were treated as discipline problems, not medical emergencies. There were also stories that guards and inmates took advantage of his mental condition. Mark reported being beaten, drugged, and even sexually abused in confinement. These claims weren't always investigated, and when they were often dismissed. What's clear is that Mark's early crimes were not about greed, hate, or thrill-seeking. They were the actions of someone who didn't understand social rules, reacted poorly under pressure, and didn't trust anyone. But instead of being treated or supported, he was punished, again and again, until escape became his only survival strategy. Arrest and escapes, a man the system couldn't hold. By the time Mark DeFriest was finally arrested for taking his father's tools and fleeing from authorities, the situation had already escalated far beyond the original offense. What started as a family dispute had grown into a case that involved theft, firearms, resisting arrest, and escape from psychiatric custody. Mark was booked into county jail. He didn't understand why everything was happening so fast, or why so many people were treating him like a threat. But instead of trying to explain himself, Mark did what he always did when he felt trapped. He looked for a way out. His first escape attempt came before he was even sentenced. Mark studied the jail's daily routines, guard movements, and even the timing of meal deliveries. One night, while most inmates were asleep, he picked a lock using a spring he had removed from a pen. He made it as far as the prison's infrastructure for hours before being found. In another case, he used knowledge of plumbing to slip through the system and come out on the other side of a locked barrier. Each time he escaped, the media started calling him names like the Houdini of Florida. But inside the system, there was no amusement. Prison officials became increasingly frustrated and afraid. Instead of asking why Mark kept running, they focused only on stopping him. That meant stricter punishment, more isolation, longer sentences, fewer privileges. But for Mark, escaping wasn't about attention or even freedom in the usual sense. He often didn't have a clear plan once he got out. He didn't try to flee the country or hide under a fake identity. Sometimes he'd be caught within a day, just wandering or sleeping in an abandoned car. His escapes were less about escape, and more about reaction, a reflex to being trapped, confused, and unheard. The system's response was to shut him down harder. Every new escape attempt led to new charges. What could have been a short sentence turned into decades. Each time he slipped through the cracks, it was treated not as a symptom of mental illness, but as a threat to order. One of his most infamous escape attempts involved covering himself in soap and squeezing through a tiny food slot in a steel door, an act that stunned prison staff. Another time, he created a false pass using materials from the prison's print shop. His ability to think like a mechanic made it nearly impossible to keep him in one place. Locks weren't obstacles, they were puzzles. But every time he was caught, his punishment grew harsher. The system stopped seeing him as a human being. He became a case file, a problem, a risk. Guards often viewed him with suspicion and fear. Other inmates didn't understand him and sometimes turned on him. Mark's world became smaller and darker, made up of cells, restraints, and silence. The more he ran, the more time he lost. The more they punished him, the more unstable he became. Over time, Mark DeFriest wasn't just a prisoner. He became a warning to others, someone the system pointed to and said, This is what happens when you don't follow the rules. But what they failed to see was that Mark never understood the rules in the first place. Solitary confinement and the breaking point. As Mark DeFriest's time in the prison system stretched on, the punishment became more severe, and the impact on his mental health grew devastating. With every escape attempt, every act of rebellion, the system responded by tightening the grip, isolating him, restricting him, breaking him down in ways that few could ever imagine. Solitary confinement became his new reality. Mark was placed in a cell that was barely larger than a closet, where the only sounds were the harsh echoes of his own thoughts and the distant clangs of prison doors. For someone like Mark, who had already struggled with emotional regulation and social understanding, this isolation was more than just a punishment. It was a slow psychological destruction. The years spent alone behind thick, steel doors began to chip away at him. His mind, which had once been sharp and focused on mechanics and problem-solving, began to fracture under the weight of loneliness. He would speak to himself for hours, sometimes even shout out loud, just to hear a voice, any voice, besides his own. But it wasn't just the silence that broke him, it was the relentless monotony. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. 27 years in solitary confinement. Mark became a ghost in the prison system, a figure that no one fully understood, someone who might never leave. His physical health deteriorated, but it was his mental health that paid the highest price. Over time, he developed deep psychological scars. He would sometimes scream at imaginary people, or speak in riddles, convinced that the walls around him were closing in. It wasn't just madness, it was a man reaching the edge of what the human mind could endure. In his rare moments outside of solitary, Mark's behavior became erratic. Prison officials would report seeing him covered in feces, screaming at invisible forces, or hurting himself as a way of coping with the unbearable isolation. The system's response? More punishment, more isolation, more time in the hole. But the story of Mark DeFriest wasn't just about the horrors of prison, it was about a system that ignored his cries for help. He wasn't a typical criminal. He wasn't a cold-hearted killer or a career criminal. He was a man with a mind that couldn't fit into the rigid structure of prison life. Yet, instead of providing him with mental health care, the system only punished him further. As Mark's condition worsened, whispers began to spread. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a man who might never have belonged in prison in the first place. Others saw him as an example of a broken system that couldn't treat its own people with basic humanity. But in the halls of Florida's correctional facilities, he was nothing more than another inmate to be controlled, subdued, and forgotten. Yet there was a growing sense that Mark's story wasn't just another prison tale. It was one that struck at the heart of human rights, mental health treatment, and justice reform. It wasn't until the release of the documentary The Mind of Mark DeFriest in 2014 that the public started to realize the full extent of what he had been through. In the documentary, Mark is seen as a broken man, his words slurred, his mind fractured, but it also highlights the crucial question: how could a system, designed to rehabilitate, fail someone so completely? Mark's life story challenged everything people thought they knew about justice and punishment. But even then, Mark was no longer the same person. The years of isolation, of running, of being treated like a number instead of a human being, had taken their toll. His mind was no longer just locked away in a prison cell. It was trapped in a cage of its own making. The road to freedom, release and public awakening. After nearly 40 years in prison, Mark DeFriest was granted early release in 2019, a decision that stunned many and marked a turning point in his long, tortured journey. For the first time in decades, Mark was going to see the outside world again. But while his physical freedom was being granted, no one could predict the toll his years in isolation would have on him, and how difficult it would be to reintegrate into a society that had long forgotten him. His body had aged, and his mind was scarred. He couldn't even operate basic technology like a smartphone or a computer. But more than anything, he struggled to navigate a world that had long passed him by. Despite his freedom, Mark's journey was far from over. He was a man broken by the system. His family was distant, the friends he had once known were gone, and he had little to no support network. The transition to life on the outside was difficult for Mark, who had spent so many years isolated and locked away. But there were those who cared. Mark was connected with mental health professionals who helped him start rebuilding his life. His new world was one of therapy, rehabilitation, and learning how to live in a society that was vastly different from the prison he had known. But it wasn't easy. The scars of the past remained, emotional and psychological wounds that no amount of freedom could erase. In the years following his release, Mark started to advocate for prison reform and mental health care for inmates. He used his own story to show how the system had failed him, and how it continued to fail others like him, those who had been forgotten and left to deteriorate in solitary confinement. Mark's case became a rallying cry for activists and advocates calling for mental health treatment within the prison system, and a re-evaluation of solitary confinement as a form of punishment. His voice, once unheard behind prison walls, was now being amplified as he shared his story publicly, speaking out against the injustices he had suffered. His story also brought attention to the mental health crisis in the prison system, where inmates with psychological issues often received inadequate care. Mark's case highlighted the extreme consequences of prolonged isolation and how it could warp a person's psyche, making them into something they were never meant to be. But even as Mark began his advocacy work, there was no fairy tale ending. Mark would never be the same. He had spent more than half of his life behind bars, and the damage to his mental health was profound. While his release brought him the physical freedom he had longed for, the emotional and psychological chains he had worn for so long remained with him. It was an ongoing battle, a battle not just for personal healing, but for justice for all those who had been mistreated by a broken system. Struggling with freedom, Mark's fight for redemption and justice. Though Mark DeFriest was finally free from the walls of prison in 2019, the reality of freedom was not as he had imagined it during all those long years of isolation. After nearly 4 decades behind bars, most of it spent in solitary confinement, the world Mark had left behind felt foreign and alien. The simple act of stepping outside was overwhelming for him. The sounds of traffic, the bright lights, the constant flow of people, it was all too much for a man who had spent years in silence, confined to a tiny, windowless cell. But it wasn't just the external world that was difficult for Mark. It was the inner turmoil, the psychological scars of a lifetime spent in prison, of years spent in complete isolation, stripped of any meaningful human contact. Mark was no longer the same man who had entered the system as a young adult. His mind had been molded and broken by decades of confinement. He had become a shadow of his former self, with the trauma of isolation echoing in every corner of his mind. Therapy became a crucial part of his life after release, and while he began to speak out about the horrors he had endured, it was clear that the road to healing was not a simple one. Mark had difficulty connecting with people, feeling out of place even among those who tried to help him. The psychological damage inflicted during his years in solitary confinement was profound. For someone who had spent more than 27 years alone in a tiny cell, Mark's ability to trust others and engage with the outside world was severely compromised. He often struggled with anxiety, depression, and feelings of alienation. But despite the challenges, Mark refused to back down. Advocacy became his mission. He began speaking publicly about his experiences in the hope that others who had suffered as he had might be able to avoid the same fate. In interviews, Mark described how solitary confinement had nearly destroyed his mind. It wasn't just the lack of human interaction that caused him harm, it was the deprivation of sensory input, the constant silence, and the crushing loneliness. He explained that the human brain was not designed to be isolated in such extreme conditions for prolonged periods. Through his advocacy work, Mark became a vocal opponent of solitary confinement, arguing that it violated basic human rights and caused irreversible damage to mental health. He also called for prison reform, particularly in terms of how inmates with mental health issues were treated. He pointed out that the prison system was not equipped to handle individuals who needed psychological help, and that people like him, who had mental health challenges, were being punished rather than helped. Mark's story reached far beyond prison reformers and activists. He became a symbol of the cruelty of solitary confinement and the need for systemic change. His case was used as an example in campaigns against the use of solitary confinement as a form of punishment. Many saw him as a tragic figure, a man whose life had been stolen by a broken system that refused to understand his mental health struggles. But not everyone saw Mark as a victim. Some critics still viewed him as a criminal, someone who had broken the law and deserved the punishment he had received. These critics pointed to the violent crimes he had committed early in his life and his repeated escape attempts. But for Mark, those actions were the result of a system that had never given him a chance to heal, to grow, or to live a normal life. In interviews, Mark would often say, "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted out." His repeated escapes were not acts of violence but acts of desperation, cries for help that had gone unheard for decades. He wasn't a man trying to evade justice. He was a man trying to survive, trying to find a way to make sense of a world that had locked him away and thrown away the key. As the years passed after his release, Mark found some peace, though it was far from the fairy tale ending that many would have hoped for. He continued to work with advocacy groups, traveling to give talks and share his story with the hope that his experiences might change the way the system treated other inmates, especially those suffering from mental illness. But there was always a lingering question: would Mark ever truly heal from the scars left by the prison system? The damage done during those years of solitary confinement had altered him forever. He would never be the man he might have been if he hadn't spent so much of his life behind bars. Despite his ongoing struggle, Mark's case became a beacon for those calling for criminal justice reform and mental health treatment in the prison system. His life had been destroyed by a system that failed to understand his needs, but in the end, it was also his story that helped bring attention to the injustices faced by countless others. Closing, a call for change. Mark DeFriest's story is one of survival, suffering, and ultimately, redemption. But it's also a stark reminder of the failures of the criminal justice system and the need for reform. Solitary confinement is a practice that has been widely criticized by experts for its devastating effects on mental health, and Mark's case is one of the most extreme examples of how a person can be broken by the system. Mark's escape from prison may have made him infamous, but his real legacy is the change he has inspired in how we view prison reform and the treatment of inmates with mental health challenges. He was a man who fought against the system, both as an inmate and later, as an advocate for change, and his fight continues to this day. Mark may have left prison, but the fight for justice, for those still trapped in a system that fails to treat them as human beings, remains. His story is far from over.